Hello students, this is a presentation about the National Republican era, which extends from the end of the War of 1812 to the election of Andrew Jackson, or approximately from 1815 to 1828. I preferred to use these two major events, the end of the War of 1812 and the election of Andrew Jackson, because they are turning points in American history. This presentation is divided into 6 major points or elements. The first one being the impact of the War of 1812 and the major consequences. The second one, as a reaction to these consequences, we look at the transformation of the Democratic Republican Party and the rise of the National Republican faction. And then we move on to westward expansion and the acquisition of new territories, and we focus on the motivations and the processes of this expansion. In number 4, we talk about the major economic and social developments accompanying both the transformation of the government and the geographical growth and territorial growth of the nation. The last 2 elements will be devoted to the rather negative and unpleasant impact of this growth and prosperity. 5 is the price of prosperity. 6, the seeds of the new political and sectional divisions. Alright, so the impact of the War of 1812. First, the War of 1812 made the Americans, especially the government, realize that Jefferson's and the Jeffersonian opposition to military spending, especially in terms of the Navy, and to the Hamiltonian financial system, was one of the major reasons for the casualties that the United States suffered from in the war, with 7,000 men in the army and 16 ships only commissioned in the Navy. The losses that Americans suffered from in the war against Britain were very significant, especially in the north. In addition, the war was financially very burdensome and costly to the United States because of the absence of a bank and a financial system that would have facilitated the sponsoring of the war. In 1811, James Madison let the bank of the first bank of the United States die without rechartering it, and this led to depleting of the treasury because of borrowing. And also, which made this worse, was the blockade that hurt American commerce very badly. Another consequence is the outcome of the Hartford Convention of 1814, in which some members of the Federalist Party and New England politicians met in Hartford, Connecticut, as a plan, by the assistance of the British, to help New England secede from the Union, because it was felt that the war hurt the New England region more than any other part of the United States. And as a result, this was a total blow to the Federalist Party, which meant that the Democratic Republican Party, after the Federalist Party had been associated with treason and with threatening the Union, the Democratic Republican Party became the only party present in American government. This was called the era of good feelings, but it wasn't really an accurate term. Also, the War of 1812 led to the rise of a new category of members of Congress called the War Hawks, who pushed James Madison to declare war against Britain, who had a very aggressive view of foreign policy. The 2 main figures were Speaker of the House Henry Clay from the West, Kentucky, and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. These figures and other ones would lead the new wave of nationalism, American nationalism, which was accompanied by internal improvements and governmental efforts to bring the nation together, in addition to an aggressive westward expansion policy and an isolationist policy vis-a-vis European powers and European conflicts. The end of hostilities in the Atlantic Ocean with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent between the United States and Great Britain had a positive impact on the United States. First, the United States, after the Anglo-French conflicts and the Anglo-American conflicts had been over, could be more preoccupied with other issues than European conflicts. And also, American neutrality was guaranteed. Better Anglo-American relations meant that the British Royal Navy would be an indirect protection against European recolonization efforts of at least North America. And also, this meant that the British ended their support for Indian tribes, which made it easier for the United States government to pursue its expansionist policy, and it made it easier for the US army to defeat Indian tribes because of the absence of the British support. And another important impact is that the United States started to get some international recognition and some independence. It asserted its independence from Great Britain. Winning the war against Britain twice made the reputation of the United States as a strong new nation very significant. The second element then is the transformation of the Democratic Republican Party. Not the whole party, but at least a significant faction inside the party, which witnessed the emergence of an ideology that would later on be called national republicanism. After the losses and casualties of the War of 1812 had been blamed on Jeffersonian ideology, which consisted of resisting strong government and strong military, especially the Navy, in addition to resistance to Hamiltonian financial and banking system. What happened inside the party is that a significant faction of this party started to abandon old Jeffersonian ideology and call for a more involvement of the government in the economy and the management of the country. Also, this transformation witnessed a significant departure from Jeffersonian ideology in terms of the military and the financial scheme, which consisted of a return and the continuation of Hamiltonian policies, the same policies against which the Democratic Republican Party was campaigning. First, Madison called for strengthening the military, especially by reconstructing the Navy and expanding the Navy, which became seen as very important factor in protecting national sovereignty, protecting national security, and also protecting American merchant ships in the high seas. Also, Madison called for a continuation of wartime tax policy and tariffs, which were very important for the financing of the government and also the financing of the strong military and naval construction. In addition to the establishment and the chartering of the second bank of the United States, which is perhaps the most significant departure from Jeffersonian ideology. The second bank of the United States had a capital of $35 million. In addition to, or as a result of the previous two developments, the rise of nationalism and return to Hamiltonian policy, was what later on would be called the American system, which consisted of the government's attempt at rebuilding infrastructures, manufacturing through protectionist tariffs, and also through government funding, which was basically done through the bank and through the new financial system that was almost a copy of the Hamiltonian financial policy. In addition to this, the government tried to improve transportation systems, especially through building canals, national roads, and later on, as a result of this, there would be the development of railroads at a later era, but this was a continuation. This would be a continuation of the American system that was established by Henry Clay and people with the nationalist agenda. Locally speaking, the government helped the states to sponsor and to fund what is called internal improvements through land policy. The states would use the money they get from the sale of lands in the funding of internal improvements at the state level. So the national government and the state governments are going to work together in order to establish and improve transportation systems and infrastructures to guarantee a harmonious coexistence between the three areas of the United States, the North, the South, and the West. All right, the third element in this presentation is westward expansion and foreign policy. First, what are the motivations that encouraged and accelerated the movement of American citizens westward, and how did this happen? How did the government and the United States land policy and foreign policy especially encourage this movement? First, the population of the United States was starting to grow very rapidly, especially after the stability that the United States witnessed after the end of the War of 1812. 1812. In addition to immigration from European countries, and the United States government did not try to block waves of immigration from Europe, because it needed human beings, it needed human power, or it needed inhabitants in order to populate the westward lands and territories that would later on become states. So besides population growth, there is also the fact that the land, especially where cotton plantations existed, was gradually exhausted and became almost useless, or at least temporarily useless, which meant that plantation owners would always look for more lands, and the only place where land was abundant, depending on what the government's policy towards the Indian tribes was the West. So there was a competition, or there was a movement of population westward from both towns, cities, and plantations. So the West becomes like a competing ground for the two types of populations, North and the South, and later on it would become a competing ground for Southern and Northern politicians, and it would be one of the major reasons for sectionalism. In addition to this, there was the spread of a nationalist ideology, the legacy of Jefferson and even Hamilton. Both Jefferson and Hamilton and the first political elite saw the United States as a nation that was destined, or that was required to grow, to expand westward, to acquire more land. Jefferson's idea of the agrarian republic and the empire of liberty was only possible through the acquisition of territories and lands. And in addition to this, as a continuation of this ideology, and an extension, if we can say so, there was the continentalist spirit among certain American politicians, namely John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams, an ex-Federalist who joins the Democratic Republican Party and who becomes President Monroe's Secretary of State, and who engineers much of what the United States foreign policy during this time is going to be about. So he is the engineer of the Monroe Doctrine. We will see it in a few minutes. So he mainly does this by making treaties with Great Britain and Spain, because these two powers are present in the Western Hemisphere, and it was necessary, John Quincy Adams saw, that the United States establishes a peaceful and diplomatic relationship with these two European powers to make sure they do not violate or threaten American expansionist ambitions. I would say there was a commercial treaty with Britain in 1815, before even Adams becomes Secretary of State, which included the most favored nation clause, which means that the United States would give advantages to Britain over other powers. Anglo-American relations have improved, and the United States' obligations towards France ended in the year 1800 with the Convention of 1800 between France and the United States. So now the United States is free to give advantages to whoever it wants. This does not mean that the US is entering an official permanent alliance with Britain, but it's just a matter of interests, trying to diplomatically protect American interests in the region. Moreover, the Convention of 1818 with Great Britain gives the United States citizens fishing rights in British colonial possessions in the Western Hemisphere. Britain is still present, especially in Canada. And also the Oregon Territory, which is between the United States Northwest and Canada, is a shared territory between the US and Great Britain. The 49th parallel is decided or chosen as the frontier line between the US and British possessions in Canada. The US also gets compensation for the slaves that were captured by Britain during the War of 1812. Another important European power present in the Western Hemisphere was Spain, and for this reason, John Quincy Adams saw that the United States should treat diplomatically with Spain to make sure it does not threaten American expansionist interests. So in 1819, after the convention with Great Britain, there was another treaty with Spain called Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, or Adams-Onis Treaty. According to this treaty, Spain would cede Florida to the United States entirely, because West Florida had been occupied previously by Andrew Jackson with the pretext of Indians who were fighting the United States and also runaway slaves who went to Florida. So in this treaty, the whole of Florida is ceded by Spain to the United States. The southern boundary of the Louisiana Territory, which had been purchased from France by the United States, is settled because it had been an issue of dispute between the two countries. Now it is settled by the Treaty of 1819. Spain gave up claims to Oregon Territory because it wasn't only the United States and Britain who were interested in controlling the Oregon Territory. Spain was also attracted to it, but on the basis of this treaty, Spain would give up its claims to Oregon and agree to the 42nd parallel as boundary between Spanish possessions and the United States. The US government, in return, relieved Spain of $5 million that it owed to American citizens, and also the United States gave up any claims to Texas. At this time, Texas is still part of New Spain or Spanish colonies. It's only when Texas is part of Mexico, after Mexico had gotten its independence from Spain, that the U.S. becomes, or Texas becomes part of the United States as a result of the Mexican-American War. Now, in addition to what has been said before, the United States foreign policy, besides its westward expansion policy, usually go hand in hand. They are influenced by circumstances in the Western Hemisphere and also in Europe. But more importantly, it's what happens in the Western Hemisphere that matters more for the United States. So after the war, between the end of the War of 1812 and 1822, there was an independence movement in Latin America by which, or through which, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and La Plata, or Argentina as we call it nowadays, would get their independence from Spain. The United States recognizes the independence of these new republics in 1822. Why does it wait until this time? Because the US government wanted to wait until Spain ratified the Transcontinental Treaty, because if it had recognized these colonies or the independence of these republics before, Spain perhaps wouldn't have ratified the treaty. In 1823, France invaded Spain and replaced the liberal government there with a conservative one. And as a result of this, the United States was afraid that Spain, with this new conservative government, with the help of France, both countries would think of recolonizing the Western Hemisphere, especially the newly independent republic. And so this is one factor why the United States was afraid of European intervention. It's the conservative Spain and France trying to recolonize the colonies or the new republics. Also, there was a resistance to republicanism in Europe. The Holy Alliance, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, was united. The members of this alliance were united in order to attempt to undo republicanism and to cancel any attempts, any rebellions, any revolutions that would replace monarchy with republicanism, because this was a threat to the ruling powers in Europe. Even though Britain was a monarchy at this time, it was more worried about European powers, European monarchies, and their competition than about republicanism. Britain had trade interests, commercial interests in the Western Hemisphere, and it was worried that those commercial interests would be threatened by what was going on in Europe. For this reason, Britain suggested a joint agreement with the United States in order to prevent any European powers from threatening British and American commercial interests in the region. The United States and Britain had a common interest, so the suggestion was made. But John Quincy Adams was convinced that Britain's support to the United States was guaranteed without anything in return, because Britain would do anything to protect its commercial interests, and it had an interest in the United States stability in the region. So he convinced James Monroe to act unilaterally, and As a result of this, James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, or that's usually called isolationism in 1823. Isolationism between quotation marks. We will see in future lectures why. Maybe this doctrine should have been called the Adams Doctrine, but since James Monroe was the president, the person who expressed this in his annual message to Congress, it was named after him. So more important is the policy itself. So in his annual message to Congress, 1823, Monroe expressed these four principles as a result of the developments we have just discussed. First, the United States would not interfere in any internal affairs or wars between European powers. So this is a non-interference principle. This is just a continuation of George Washington's and Thomas Jefferson's neutrality principles. Or European intervention with the new republics of the Western Hemisphere would not be accepted. This is the non-intervention principle. 3. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. Any territories that are not colonized yet or that are open to colonization the United States would not accept the colonization of any new territories by European powers. And any attempt at doing so would be considered as a threat to the United States, like national security. So non-colonization principle. Also, the United States was afraid that the power that France has over the new Spanish government, the US was afraid that with this power, France would make this new Spanish government transfer its colonial possessions to France, and the presence of France in the United States would be threatening. So the non-transfer of any colony from one power to another, so non-transfer principle. It's like a hands-off policy. The US would not interfere in European affairs and would not accept intervention in the new republics by Europeans, would not accept colonization, future colonization, would not accept transfer. This policy meant that the United States would start thinking in the future, Americans would start thinking of the world into black and white, or into Europe, old, traditional monarchy, aristocracy, the new world, the Western Hemisphere, republicanism, independence, revolutions, and so on. So this is basically the foundation of the Monroe Doctrine or isolationism. Internationally, the Monroe Doctrine did not have any legal status. European powers did not give much attention to this kind of discourse. However, this policy was the foundation, or would be the foundation, of future foreign policy making in much of the 19th century and also in the first half of the 20th century, even though there are some slight changes and differences, and even though the word isolationism should not be taken at face value or for granted. And also, the United States, even though it was not very powerful at this time compared to other European powers, the British Royal Navy was an indirect protection and guarantee of the Monroe Doctrine. European powers were not really afraid of the United States, but they worried about British reaction, because Britain had an interest in the principles that were established in the Monroe Doctrine.
It was a British idea in the first place.
All right, the fourth element of the presentation is major economic and social developments. The migration of American citizens and of some immigrants westward led to the emergence of a new way of life, and also with it a mobile society that was obsessed with movement, with discovery, with change, with mobility. This movement was characterized by its variety. First, you have the original American citizens moving westward, looking for an opportunity after American towns had become overcrowded, and after lands had become exhausted and not sufficient for the large number of American citizens after the population growth. This meant that in the West, especially the West, now the West is becoming a new part of the United States, and in this area there are going to be a lot of towns that are going to be established and communities. As far as factories and industry is concerned, you will have usually building of towns near job opportunities and factories, and also the building of plantations for people who were involved in agriculture, and especially cotton plantations. In addition to this, you have the beginning of the transformation of the United States in terms of ethnicity. There are going to be new ethnic elements from Europe that are going to be part of the United States, and gradually this is going to be the seed of future tensions, racial tensions, ethnic tensions, and one of the major consequences of this is the nativist movement. The emergence of factories led to the transformation of labor from being independent workshop owners, craftsmen, independent manufacturers, small-scale manufacturers. Many Americans became parts or workers of big factories, and this transformed the nature of labor. Instead of having one person who is specialized in making a product from beginning to end, we have a factory with many people, each group of people specialized in only one part of the process, which meant that skill is becoming less and less important because the person is not going to make a product from beginning to end. And this also leads to the rise of new social segments, factory owners, and later on the capitalists and the workers. They are no longer independent manufacturers, they're not farmers, they are the working class. And this rise of these two leads to new tensions and new conflicts, especially as a result of the exploitation. This time there are no laws regulating the activities of factory owners and no laws protecting workers from exploitation. And this leads to the emergence of the labor movement. So you have the new classes emerging, you have the nature of production and manufacturing is transformed into mass production. You also have new tensions, new conflicts. This is important because there are a lot of people who are going to see this phenomenon as the result of government policies. They are going to be dissatisfied with the government because they see that this government, especially the National Republican government, is helping big business, if we can say so. At this time it wasn't really big business, but factory owners and financial interests at the expense of farmers and the working classes. Banks became very attractive because they were involved both in sponsoring, financing, farming, plantations, and also factories and investment. So the financial system based on banking is going to entangle almost everyone to the interdependence of the different parts of the society. Almost every segment of the society is going to be involved in this banking system, which means that if anything happens, if any problem takes place, everyone is going to be affected. The emergence of factories made the production of cotton very profitable because with factories came the textile industry. And the mechanization of the textile industry and the use of mass production made the demand for cotton increase. It means that more and more can be produced in a short time. And the supply of cotton has to be guaranteed at a quicker pace than in the past. As a result of this, slavery became more important than before for plantation owners because slavery meant labor that would guarantee the supply of cotton, which means profit. And as a result of the previous factors, we witness in this era the widening of the gap between the North and the South. At the same time that the American system is bringing the whole nation together through transportation, through market economy, through banking, it's also widening the gap and the split between the two in terms of ideology, in terms of economic sectors on which they are going to build their strength, especially political strength. So there are social differences in the society. In the North you have factory owners, you have workers. In the South you have small farmers, slaveholders, slaves. Ideology also in relation to slavery. The economic differences are going to be important, and this also leads to political conflicts. The South and the North are going to transform their differences into political conflicts in Congress, and later on this conflict would become or would lead to the Civil War. Or the society changed very significantly at this time. The bartering system, the exchange system, the local system that Jefferson had dreamed of, in which members of the same small community of the state would cooperate, would be characterized by virtue, by generosity, by helping one another, by becoming independent from big financial interests, disappeared. All this disappeared and was replaced by self-interest culture that dominated this process of westward expansion and also of nation building. Moreover, the market economy made it necessary to to establish cash instead of goods. Cash becomes the most important element in this economy, and cash means banks. And cash is usually, currency is usually not stable in terms of the value it has. And the dependence on currency has advantages, but sometimes leads to panics, leads to economic depressions that affect everyone involved because currency is impersonal. 5. Price of prosperity. The economic and financial revolution that the United States was witnessing at this time was not without risks. There were problems with banks and factories especially. In the year 1819, the second bank of the United States called in loans because it saw that the state chartered banks were exaggerating in their practice of issuing banknotes which did not really match the hard currency that they had in their bank reserves. And at this time also there was a collapse of cotton prices worldwide, and the result of with these factors combined, a lot of farmers were ruined because they could not pay the loans. So their houses, their farms were taken away from them because they used the mortgage system. And also many banks went bankrupt, so the bankruptcy of many banks. Many people were unemployed as a result of this panic. And this basically made the people start to have a negative and skeptical attitude towards the new financial system, and especially the banks. States usually sided with farmers. Whenever there was a farmer who, because of debts, was going to lose his house or farm, the states tried to postpone foreclosures and to force creditors to accept banknotes. And the state governments also closed many banks because they saw that these banks were the major cause of this panic. The Supreme Court sided with the banks because the Supreme Court, according to the Constitution, because the central government, including the Supreme Court, has, among other roles, the protection of contract. And the relationship between the banks and the farmers who took loans from these banks was considered as contract. So it tried to prevent states from interfering in the banks and in the competitive forces of the markets. In addition, mass production, the transformation of manufacturing into mass production and with the low prices led to the decrease of the wages of the workers. So the working class people were employed by factories with very low wages. And this gave them the impression that they are exploited. And labor unions emerged to bring solutions to these problems, to improve working conditions, to improve wages for workers. But the court defended factory owners at the expense of the workers. And this is another example of how the people are starting to look at the government and all the institutions that represent the government as being at the service of narrow interests and at the expense of the large public. Besides the social and financial price that many farmers and common people had to pay as a result of national growth, westward expansion, the implementation of the American system, there was also, at a higher level, especially in Congress and in the government, the beginning of sectional and political divisions, very similar to those that had taken place earlier during the Federalist era. Geographically speaking, there was a competition, rivalry between the North and the South over the new territories that were being admitted to the Union as states in the West. So the West becomes the battleground, if we can say so, between the free states and slave states. And this also means between the North and the South. So besides the political divisions that had already taken place, that hadn't disappeared completely in relation to the attitude towards the government, the relationship between the central government and the local governments, there was also a new aspect of these divisions, which is the sectional aspect, geographical aspect. The admission of new territories thus intensified this rivalry. An incident in which this rivalry became very flagrant and apparent was the admission of Missouri. Missouri Territory applied for joining the Union as a state in 1819. And one New York representative, Talmadge, presented an amendment that prevented the introduction of further slaves in in this territory and the future state of Missouri, and also this amendment would also lead to the gradual disappearance of slavery from the territory. What this did was antagonize the slave states, the southern pro-slavery states, because they saw this as the beginning of the violation of the federal government of local and state rights. So there was a controversy for a whole year, and it was finally resolved when Maine, which had been under the government of Massachusetts, applied to join the Union as a free state. So there was a possibility of making a balance, because the origin of the controversy in the first place is that the time that Missouri was being admitted to the Union, there was an equal number of free states and slave states in Congress. And the admission of Missouri as a slave state would create a kind of lack of balance between the two. So the admission of Maine as a free state would guarantee this balance. In addition, Senator J.B. Thomas of Illinois presented an amendment prohibiting slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the southern boundary of Missouri. The significance of the Missouri Compromise is that it demonstrates that the era of good feelings is insignificant, because tensions and conflicts still continued after the United States government was dominated by one party. Inside the same party, there were tensions, sometimes in relation to the role of the central government and also in relation to slavery. Besides this sectional conflict, there was also the return to the political opposition similar to that which characterized the Federalist era. One of the major concerns was the role of the government, also the significance, the constitutionality of the Second Bank of the United States, very similar to the opposition, very similar to the controversy over the First Bank of the United States. And this was visible in the election of 1824. There were 4 candidates: William H. Crawford of Georgia, who was an extreme states' rights advocate; Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who was a little bit unpopular; and Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House and the champion of the American system; and Andrew Jackson, who was an outsider, very much like Trump nowadays. He was a military hero. He wasn't. He hadn't had much political experience. He was seen as an outsider. He had assistance from Tennessee. He won the popular vote, but he didn't win the majority necessary for accessing the presidency. So Crawford was ill, could not continue the race. Clay was out of the race, and there was only Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. What Henry Clay did was support John Quincy Adams because he was, like Henry Clay, a supporter of nationalism and the American system, unlike Andrew Jackson, who was the enemy of the bank, the enemy of government intervention in states' affairs. What happened later on is that when John Quincy Adams became president, he made Henry Clay Secretary of State. This was interpreted by Jacksonians as evidence that Henry Clay supported John Quincy Adams only to get a position in the new government. This was called the corrupt bargain. So after the election in 1824, John Quincy Adams won the election. And in this era, 1824 to 1828, John Quincy Adams is going to gradually lose popularity. And with him, the American system, the Second Bank of the United States, the new strength, the new powers that the federal government is having are going to be unpopular among the electorate. And also one of two major moves made by Adams, or during Adams's presidency, accelerated this shift from support of national Republicans and their American system to the support of a new ideology and new agenda. In 1826, in the Panama Conference, Adams sent delegates, and this conference was unpopular because it included Haitian delegates who were blacks, because Haiti was a country that was created as a result of slave rebellion, a large slave rebellion. So ex-slaves rebelled against Napoleon and got their independence. In addition to this, there was a protective tariff, very compatible with the Hamiltonian agenda, with the American system, and the National Republican agenda, which aimed at protecting local manufacturers, local industry, by imposing tariffs on imported goods. And again, this was seen as a measure of favoritism that would give advantage to the industrial or the gradually industrializing North at the expense of Southern agrarian interests. In this context, there was a dissatisfaction from 1824 to 1828. There was a growing dissatisfaction with the government among the electorate, among the people, and at the same time inside the Democratic Republican Party itself. There was the popular view that the government is trying to strengthen its own powers and at the same time to strengthen financial interests embodied in the second bank of the United States, at the expense of Southerners and at the expense of the common people. As a result of this, the election of 1828 would witness a very significant and radical shift in American politics.